Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth, a book I reread this year more than a month ago, but it's still fantastic. It's a book that stays with me. It stayed with me for almost 30 years at this point. This is one of those books I've reread just about once a decade, and I really was captured by it the first time I read it. Of course, I had seen the film adaptation, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was something different, and the book is in many ways a spy thriller, a crime-adjacent book that is something different. It's not about the mystery of whether or not will it succeed. Forsyth sort of knew that President Jackal had not been assassinated. His publishers knew this. That was part of the controversy about whether or not it would sell. It's all about the process. It's the anatomy of the plot. Is how he titles the first portion of the book, and that's almost what this book could be titled, is Anatomy of a Plot. It's all about the process behind the attempt. Who is this guy? How does he go about his plan? How is he brought in by this dissident group within the OAS? It uses the skeletal framework of actual things that happened. There was an actual assassination attempt on Charles de Gaulle and on his wife by a group of French officers, and that's what the book starts with. There was an OAS. It was very violent. It was scary. There was an assassination of a chief of state in the 1960s. It happened to be President Kennedy, not President de Gaulle. But all of those things are brought together and brewed together. But that skeletal framework is what Forsyth puts his character into. We have an unnamed English assassin who is very much a hunter of people, and we see the way he moves through the book. And that was something that drew me in the first time I read it, was just the way that the book was from this perspective of a guy who is never named, who we don't really know enough about. We don't have a lot of insight into his personal life beyond that he would like to live well for the rest of his life, and if the money from this assassination will give him that freedom. But we don't really know a lot about him. He's colorless in many ways. We know much more about Claude Lebel, the man who is hunting the hunter, the man who is trying to figure out this man's identity. And so the way that all of those tendrils of the plot move and expand out and then come together ultimately at the end remains something that's incredibly well paced. And it's just incredibly detailed. The process behind this plot and this plan is really interesting to dip into and to see the way it unfolds. It's an incredibly readable book. It's an incredibly accessible book. One thing that I noticed on this reread, as I said, I've read this a number of times now, one thing I noticed was there's one interesting detail that I found in the book that I hadn't really remembered. I think I remembered it from the very, very end of the book, but I didn't remember it from the other times. And that's that Forsyth, just about every time a character is killed, we get an insight into that person's mind for one sentence or one paragraph that allows us to see like what that person's last perception of reality is. And it creates this almost experimental form to the book. It's very much this procedural that's slowly, page by page, going through what's happening. We're not being told what the plan is in advance. We're seeing how it's being built up. We know where the Jackal plans to make his assassination attempt. We know what weapon he's going to use, but we don't know quite all of the details until that moment happens. And so that pacing is really well done. But this intrusion of every time there's violence, just about every time there's violence, it suddenly swings over to this other point of view, this other perception. Just for a moment, we have this flash that interrupts the pacing of the narrative, and I think it causes the violence on those pages to land in a different way. It unsettles the reader as we see this happening. And so I wanted to read one passage of that just to give a sense of, well, actually, I want to read a couple of pages that get into the details, and then I'll read at the end a passage that gets at that idea of how Forsyth interrupts the reader. He noted the details as the Jackal, thanked the vicar profusely, and left. Back in London, he presented himself at the Central Registry of Births, Marriages, and Deaths, where a helpful young assistant accepted without query his visiting card, showing him to be a partner in a firm of solicitors of Market Drayton, Shropshire, and his explanation that he was engaged in trying to trace the whereabouts of the grandchildren of one of the firm's clients who had recently died and left her estate to her grandchildren. One of these grandchildren was Alexander James Quentin Duggan, born at Samburn Fishley in the parish of St. Mark's on April 3rd, 1929. Most civil servants in Britain do their best to be helpful when confronted by a police inquiry, and in this case the assistant was no exception. A search of the records showed that the child in question had been registered precisely according to the inquirer's information, but had died on November 8, 1931, as the result of a road accident. For a few shillings, the Jackal received a copy of both the birth and death certificates. Before returning home, he stopped at a branch office of the Ministry of Labor and was issued a passport application form at a toy shop, where for 15 shillings he bought a child's printing set, and at a post office for a £1 postal order. Back in his flat, he filled in the application form in Duggan's name, giving exactly the right age, date of birth, etc., but his own personal description. He wrote in his own height, color of hair and eyes, and for profession put down simply businessman. The full names of Duggan's parents taken from the child's birth certificate were also filled in. For the reference, he filled in the name of Reverend James Elderly, vicar of St. Mark's, Samburn Fishley, to whom he had spoken that morning, and whose full name and title of LLD had been obligingly printed on a board outside the church gate. The vicar's signature was forged in a thin hand in thin ink with a thin nib, and from the printing set he made up a stamp reading, St. Mark's Parish Church, Samburn Fishley, which was placed firmly next to the vicar's name. And he goes on to describe it in the ensuing pages how he's acquiring stolen passports, how he does this workaround to acquire a fake passport, something that actually worked at the time. Later on, we're given the narration of how he's testing out his rifle. Satisfied with the gun, he noted the positioning of the grub screws that adjusted the telescopic sight, and taking a tube of balsa wood cement from his pocket, squirted the viscous liquid over the heads of both grub screws and the surface of the bake light adjacent to them. Half an hour and 2 cigarettes later, the cement was hard, and the sights were set for his eyesight with that particular weapon at 130 meters, at spot-on accuracy. From his other breast pocket, he took the explosive bullet, unwrapped it, and slid it into the breech of the rifle. He took particularly careful aim at the center of the melon and fired. As the last plume of blue smoke curled away from the end of the silencer, the Jackal laid the rifle against the tree and walked down the clearing towards the hanging shopping bag. It sagged, limp and almost empty, against the scarred trunk of the tree. The melon that had absorbed 20 lead slugs without coming to pieces had disintegrated. Parts of it had been forced through the mesh of the bag and lay scattered on the grass. Pips and juice dribbled down the bark. The remaining fragments of the fruit's flesh lay broken in the lower end of the shopping bag, which hung like a weary scrotum from the hunting knife. So we're dealing with the process over and over, and it's similar from the perspective of LaBelle and his assistant as they try to trace the Jackal and figure out where, how would we find this passport, and who could this person be? And they think they might have an identity, but they're not sure, and the British are helping and scoping out that apartment. And so we're constantly involved in the process, but every now and then we get these moments. The slug from the Jackal's rifle tore into his chest, struck the sternum, and exploded. There was a feeling of tearing and ripping and of great sudden stabs of pain. Then even they were gone. The light faded as if summer had turned to winter. A piece of carpet came up and smacked him on the cheek, except that it was his cheek that was lying on the carpet. The loss of feeling swept up through the thighs and belly, then the chest and neck. The last thing he remembered was a salty taste in the mouth, like he had had after bathing in the sea at Kermadec, and a one-legged old gull sitting on a post. Then it was all dark. And those intrusions really give this novel something else. There's something Forsyth accomplished here. The combination of history and technical aspects to the conspiracy and to the police work, the police procedural work that he's working with, the way that he's ripped these ideas from history, the actual assassination of JFK a decade earlier, all of that is combined to create this very effective, very haunting thriller. One that I highly, highly encourage folks to check out if you're interested in this type of writing or work at all. Certainly there's the great film adaptation, one of my favorites. It's one as I said, I reread the book every decade. I rewatch the film probably every 5 years. And I think the great sort of assassination conspiracy novel for many readers is Don DeLillo's Libra, which I have a video on. I'll put that in the description box. This gets us into the mind of Lee Harvey Oswald and into the minds of a CIA guy who's researching what might have been happening in this sort of conspiracy adjacent to, around Oswald. And so this is a very good book, very different from The Day of the Jackal, but the ways that they intrude on each other, and DeLillo's idea that fiction rescues history from its confusions is, I think, effective in both works. Another few that jump to mind, certainly there's Rogue Mail by Jeffrey Household. This one gets us the mind of a guy who is being hunted, and we don't know why, that he escaped somehow, and now he's basically trapped like a fox within its den by a couple of men who want to kill him. And it gradually unfolds that there's been something else going on. This is one of the best books I read for the first time in the past 5 years, and one I would really encourage readers who enjoy The Day of the Jackal or Libra to try out. Charles McCarry's The Tears of Autumn will be a book I revisit later this year. And this is one of the earliest books that deals with the JFK assassination and a conspiracy theory around it. Even if it's one that's perhaps not currently plausible, it was an interesting first window into that. And it's very contemporary to The Day of the Jackal. Another work that came to mind was Murder at the Savoy by Sjöwall and Wahlöö, a later Martin Beck novel, and one that gets at the idea that there can be just random murders, that someone powerful can be killed and there can be no plot behind it, or no motive behind it beyond just wanted violence. And that's a really interesting idea within here that contrasts with the idea of assassination. A couple more books, Jean Larteguy's The Centurions and the Praetorians, get into the point of view of the French soldiers who were in Southeast Asia and then in Algeria, and their ethos, their sort of chauvinism and violence combining together. Georges Simenon's Dirty Snow gives us an interesting world into occupied France, and the way that the sense of violence and danger that sort of lurks around every corner in here evokes The Day of the Jackal in good form. Certainly the Battle of Algiers, the great film from the mid-1960s that portrays the horrors of the French occupation in Algeria. And then a couple of other books. The Private Sector by Joseph Hone is I haven't read this one, but I'm going to probably read it maybe next year. But this almost seems to be sort of what if the Day of the Jackal was happening, if the Jackal was on a different mission in Africa itself, in Africa. Dog Soldiers by Robert Stone captures sort of that era. It's from the 1970s. It was a National Book Award winner, which seems wild for a book that's essentially a crime novel. And one that I would really, really encourage readers to check out. And then probably next year I'll try The Fourth Protocol by Frederick Forsyth. I've read The Odessa File, The Dogs of War, and neither of those was quite at the level of the Day of the Jackal, but I'm interested in trying this one out. I've heard good things about it. So let me know if you're a Forsyth fan, or if you're a fan of The Day of the Jackal, and I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.